Hello and welcome to a live stream of Cloud with Chris. You're with me, Chris Reddington, and we will be talking about all things cloud. Now, thank you is how I first want to start off with this particular episode. It's been a bit of a journey to get here. I started off probably 6 months ago or so with some podcasting, and it was always a bit of an aim of mine to start doing things on YouTube and potentially even Twitch, and to start doing live streaming, and I'm finally here. So just a big thank you to everyone for all the likes, the follows, the support, because that's really encouraged me to get working on this and get going. So if you're new, you know the deal, you've probably heard it on other channels. Please go ahead, please subscribe on the channel, please do like and please do reshare as well, because it will help just get the brand out there and help encourage me to push some more content out. Now on content, we've got a good few weeks of content coming up. So we've already scheduled in next week's session. I'm going to be joined by Will Eastbury, one of my colleagues who is very, very clever in the architecture space from a cloud perspective. And we're going to be talking about a particular cloud pattern where he put together some documentation for that and put it out to the world. So that's going to be very exciting. And then the week after, we're going to have another ex-colleague of mine, now works with Azure Active Directory, and that is Christos Matskas. So again, 2 weeks of very interesting content coming up, and no doubt we'll be scheduling more as we go for the coming weeks as well. So if you do have any topics you want to talk about, if you want to actually be a guest on here and you want to have a discussion with me as well, just let me know. www.cloudwithchris.com, and what you can do is sign up to the forms on there. So with that, all of the admin is out of the way, let's get on to the fun stuff. We're going to be talking today about Azure Functions and GitHub Actions. And we're going to be talking about GitHub Actions, I guess, in general. And Azure Functions just happens to be the thing that we're talking about here today. So I've been working on a pet project for a little while. And this particular pet project is based on a bit of a hobby of mine. And for anyone who's doesn't know what this is, you can see here I've got a couple of cards. If I just bring them into the camera a little bit more there, these are called Yu-Gi-Oh cards. So imagine the kind of football cards, baseball cards, Pokemon cards, that type of thing. Yu-Gi-Oh is an anime that I used to watch when I was a lot younger, and I used to collect those cards. Stopped collecting them, and with everything going on with COVID and kind of lockdown, my usual hobbies of theatre weren't really something that I can do. So I figured, what can I do? Try and get away a little bit from the technology for a while. So went ahead and started with these once again. So that got me thinking. I've started building up a bit of a collection, and I want to be able to understand what cards I've got, what cards I'm missing, and go from there. Now, of course, people are probably sat here watching and thinking, Chris, why don't you just go ahead and use Excel or a database or something like that? You could put a quick thing together in seconds for that. But that's obviously not what I wanted to do. I wanted to solve an interesting problem, and I figured if I'm having this problem, other people probably have this problem as well. So it got me thinking and going on this kind of little quest, if you like, in terms of how I might go and build some kind of software as a service, some kind of multi-tenant platform that any user might be able to go and store an inventory of their cards. Could it eventually be used for people to trade? And, you know, from there, the requirements started spanning out. And by no means have I got a fully working service and a working product yet. But I've got the kind of the basics there, the minimum viable product, and I'm keeping iterating over that in the spare time that I have. So what I want to do with you all today is just walk through GitHub Actions, what they are, and talk a little bit about how I've used GitHub Actions in my particular project here. So you've probably guessed from the title, the description, and the blurb so far, It's a little bit focused on Azure Functions, also storage as well, the static content side. So I've gone for a bit more of a serverless kind of setup in terms of my deployment. And perhaps we can do another session where we look more at the architecture. But really today is going to be more focused on the deployment aspects, not so much of the infrastructure, but looking at the GitHub side of things. So let's jump over to the other screen. So GitHub Actions, as you can imagine, is a part of GitHub, and it's one of these features of GitHub which has really grown strong over the last year or so. And the idea is you should be able to automate a workflow. That's why in GitHub Actions they are called workflows rather than pipelines or anything similar, because the idea is it's not just about your CI/CD. Imagine that you've got a set of GitHub issues that you're working on. Maybe you run an open source project and you have new contributors and you want to welcome them to the repository. Or you want to kind of scan a comment for certain keywords and be able to respond in a certain way. Well, GitHub Actions has you covered because, as I say, it's not just focused on CI/CD. So what we will really focus on today is more of the CI/CD side of things, but along the way I'll just show you some of the tips and tricks where you can go ahead and use it for things which aren't CI/CD. Now, for anyone who's unsure what CI/CD is, CI is continuous integration and CD is continuous delivery. So continuous integration, what that means is when we're developing software, we constantly need to go and commit our code to some kind of central area. A version control is what it's commonly called. And with GitHub, the version control that we care about and we're talking about is Git. Now, the thing about Git is the way that it's structured under the covers is it allows people to kind of work in parallel really well and really easily. So it allows this kind of distributed way of working for people rather than having to work in a centralized system, unlock files while other people are working on them. Each person has their own copy and they keep pushing to that central place. So if you think about that problem and you've got a team of many developers, you're going to have a problem there, because what if I go ahead and work on the same code base on the same file as my friend Will? Well, what's going to happen is we potentially clash. We get a merge conflict. So we don't want that. We want to go ahead and work in something called branches. Now, these branches are separate, and what we have to do is merge that code into that common area. Now, this is where continuous integration is really useful, because if I make some changes, or if Will makes some changes, or whoever else makes some changes, and we do something to break that code, maybe it no longer compiles into a working application, or maybe we actually run some tests as part of that step and the tests fail. What that allows us to do very early on is understand the feedback. It gives us very quick understanding of whether that software is working as expected or whether it's not working and we shouldn't push that forward to our live users. Because of course, if we push that into production to our live users, they'll get very angry. You know, if it's for my Yu-Gi-Oh cards website, for example, and I eventually monetize it, if that was an idea, my users wouldn't be very happy if they're paying for a service that is not very stable, that is going to go down. So that's the idea behind using things like CI and this concept of shifting left, you might hear it called sometimes, where you really think about quality up front in your development cycle rather than later on. And then the CD aspect, the continuous delivery, is this idea that you're continually shipping that code out to your environments. And in these very mature DevOps setups, the idea is that all of those environments could and maybe should be production. There's the idea of something called a ring deployment. There's also other concepts of a classic setup like dev, test, prod, we won't really cover that today. If that's of interest, we can talk about it another time for sure. But in this scenario, in this section, all you really need to worry about is the fact that you have CI and CD. So, now that we've covered that, the great thing about GitHub Actions is it's possible for us to work across different environments here. So imagine that I've got an open source code base like Node.js or something similar, and I want that code base to run across different platforms. Well, there's a really easy way for me to go and test that across different platforms, and that's using things like these matrix builds and these different operating systems, and being able to run the same workload and the same build across those different environments. It doesn't matter what language we're writing in, and we can get some real-time output as well. And the beauty of this is there were days where, developers would joke that if I go ahead and click F5 and I'm going and building my code, that I would then be stopped. I would no longer be productive, and I'd have to go on my coffee break or whatever it would be, because, I'd tell my manager, oh, the code's compiling, can't do any more, we got to wait for that code to compile. That's not true anymore. I'm sorry to say it, maybe I've rumbled a few developers out there, but that's not true. What you can do is go ahead and something like GitHub Actions, wherever those agents or those runners, as they're called in GitHub Actions world, they will go and do that build for us and do that compilation and maybe those tests or whatever steps we have gone ahead and put in our workflow. So you can see here there's tons of these different actions that you can go and use. We'll take a look at some of those a little bit later, so don't worry about those too much for now. But for public repositories, GitHub Actions are completely free because, of course, GitHub is all about open source. For private repositories, you still get a good amount as well. If you've got the free tier of private repositories, you get 2,000 minutes a month, and you can see the different scales there, depending on the organization that you are. So, let's just go ahead and jump into some of the GitHub Actions information a moment. And if you've never really looked at GitHub before, this might be a little confusing in terms of the different tabs that I'm jumping between here. So all of this information is on docs.github.com. It's a really great website. Go and take a look at it, because it has these things called quick starts here as well for you, and lists the popular articles and all of the things that might be needed for you to really get going quickly and get set up for that quick start there. So as you can see here, this is what an example quick start workflow looks like for a GitHub action. So for a GitHub action to work, you need a GitHub repository. It doesn't build from an external repository, so if you use something like Azure Repos, if you use Bitbucket, if you use GitLab or something like that, you have to go ahead and use a GitHub repository for that GitHub action workflow to work. So you can't build from another repository. And the actual workflow itself, as it's called, looks something like this. Let me zoom in. Now this is what we call a YAML template. And if you've ever done any Azure pipelines, or maybe Circle CI, or maybe you've done some Kubernetes development in the past, you'll be kind of familiar with the YAML setup. YAML just means yet another markup language, and you can see that it's just a set of key value pairs, and some of those keys have nested values, so they're like an object at that point. And you can have arrays, and you can have elements in those arrays as well. And all that this is doing is just representing some information. And this information is how we want our workflow to work. So you can see here that we have a workflow called superlinter. And what we're going to do is that workflow will be triggered every time there's a new commit to the repository. So on a push. And we then have potentially a number of jobs underneath it. We only have one in this one, and that's called superlint. And what we then do is we just give it a display name and, a nice friendly name for people to see when they're looking in the user interface. It's called lint codebase. It runs on Ubuntu latest. And all it does is it goes ahead, it checks out the code, and it runs a superlinter. But there's something interesting going on in these users section here. So let's just take a look at that a little bit more and see what's going on. Well, you can see that we've got this kind of action / checkout thing going on, and then the @ and then v2. And you'll see the same again under here. We've got GitHub and superlinter at v3. So what does that mean? Well, if we take a look and actually navigate to a different page here, and we just copy that little bit here, there we go, and we go to github.com/ and paste that in, what you'll notice is this is just a GitHub repository. If I scroll down, you'll see that actually there's a really nice helpful README about that action. Now hold on a minute. We were just talking about GitHub Actions. Why are we looking at a GitHub repository? Well, that's the interesting thing about GitHub Actions, is that the code for the GitHub Actions can typically either be held in a GitHub repository like this, so you store it as like a JavaScript, I believe, or TypeScript, and either that or a Docker file and a Docker image. So those are the two types of ways that you can actually go ahead and run your GitHub Actions. So what we're saying here is we're referencing that actually, hey, there's this public action out there that's available. I want to go ahead and use version 2 of that. So if we actually go and take a look in here at the releases, we can see that actually this has been released to the marketplace. This is the latest release. And lo and behold, we can see the v2 tag right there. So we can see that v2 tag relates to this particular commit that happened 9 days ago. So that's really what we are referring to when we look at that v2 tag. It's just a particular version of the code base at that point in time. So then we've also got the superlinter, of course, as well. So let's go ahead and take a look for completeness. So we'll just go ahead, boop, and get rid of that bit. And now we're looking at the superlinter. And as you can see, again, a very similar idea. It's under the GitHub organization, and then there's a repo called superlinter. And if we just scroll down, you can see there's a load of great information here about what linters this particular action supports, and then the different examples here of running that particular workflow and that particular GitHub action. Now, all that we need to do is take one of these files and save it in a special folder inside of our GitHub repository. We save it in this folder .github/workflows. And then when it's inside of that particular folder, GitHub Actions knows that that is something it needs to treat as a workflows file. So what we would then do is we would commit that into our code base, and if we're following good practices, we don't commit directly to main. We go ahead and we push that in a branch, and then we merge that later on into our main branch or dev branch, whichever way that our development lifecycle is working. And again, if those terms are confusing, let me know in the comments below, because I could fill a whole session on development lifecycle all on its own, and that's another topic rather than today's session here. So then what we can do is we can go and view the actual results of that workflow running. So we won't look at that example for a moment. What we'll do is we'll just carry on exploring a little bit more and just understand what's going on. So I mentioned that those GitHub Actions are actually just backed by GitHub repositories. So what you'll notice, if you go to the marketplace and you select on Actions here, there are a load of actions which are available for you to go and use. Some of them will be on the marketplace already. Some of them will just be in people's repositories, whether they're public or private. And you need to kind of evaluate what that action is doing. So if I go ahead and take a look for Azure GitHub Actions, you can see that there are just tons of these GitHub Actions available here. Some of them have that Azure logo and the blue Azure tick to say that it's the creator has been verified by GitHub. And then there are these other ones which are made by the community. Now, just bear in mind that, you're taking a dependency on any of these actions. So do your due diligence like you would with the code that is going into your code base. What are you depending on? What are you actually relying upon? And is that going to be supported? Is that going to be maintained? And what happens if there's an urgent problem with that particular action? How is it going to get fixed? And once you understand all of those pieces, how those dependencies work, and you're comfortable, go ahead and adopt them into your workflow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of the actions that I went ahead and used. So for a lot of these GitHub actions, they really start from this Azure Login action. And as you can imagine, all this Azure Login action is doing is going ahead and using some kind of credential that you've given it and logging in with that. So typically you'd give it some kind of service principal, an unattended login, because something like GitHub Actions and DevOps in general is not something where you have a UI kind of experience and you can kind of click approve and do next. You want it to run in an automated way, so you'd have a service principal. So what you can do in GitHub Actions is you can go ahead and add these secrets, and I'll show you those a little bit later. But what you do is you just go ahead and specify this Azure Login task, this action here, with, and that's just a property inside of GitHub Actions. Creds is then the property for this particular action, and we just reference that secret then, and we've called that secret Azure Credentials. So that's the first action that I used. I also used a couple of other actions. So one was this Azure CLI action, and you'll see that a little bit later in action. There we go, lots of actions going on. And the other one that I used is the Azure Functions action. So again, I'm sure we will dig that out and find that. There's one for function containers. I've probably skipped past the other one, but that's okay. We'll come back to it. So again, there's plenty of these actions available. And of course, there are some which will be third party, remember, and made by the community. And those will be, I'm sure there are people in the community that make great stuff. Of course there are. This is what open source is all about. But you just need to be careful and mindful about what dependencies you're taking, just like you would with any other open source technologies. So let's now go and do some digging and take a look at the workflow syntax. So inside of GitHub Actions, you obviously saw the YAML file a little bit earlier that we were using. And this YAML file started with a name. It has an on property. That on property has certain triggers. And let's jump over to this particular page. I mentioned earlier, CI and CD is not everything that GitHub Action is focused on. GitHub Actions focuses on a lot more than just when you commit something. So for example, you could go ahead and trigger on a push. You could go ahead and trigger on a push and a pull request if you like. You could even go ahead and do it on, different kind of triggers for those different properties. So if it's a push, then you only want to do it on the main branch. If it's a pull request, only do it on the main branch. But you've also got these other types of events. So you can see here we've got a page builder event or release as well. You can have these scheduled events. So you can do it on a particular cadence, like every 5 minutes, every 15 minutes, every Monday at 5 p.m, whatever it may be, using the typical kind of cron syntax there. You can go ahead and go manual events and do a workflow dispatch. You've got a number of webhook type events. And those are the types of things where things like a push to our repository would come under these webhook events. But a check run is to do with kind of checks inside your GitHub Actions workflow. Anytime there's a create event, a delete event, a deployment, you can see here, deployment status, a fork, column, issue comment, issues. So just think about that scenario I mentioned earlier. If we had someone creating their brand new issue, or it wasn't assigned, or it was assigned, or it was transferred, and we wanted some automation to happen as a result of that, GitHub Actions has you covered. Maybe we've assigned a certain label and we need to go and trigger an event to happen. Again, we can do that. Maybe a milestone has been created or closed. Maybe a page build has happened. We saw that earlier. A project has been created. And you can see underneath all of these different types of events, we have these different types of activities. So we can be really specific on the types of activities that we want to go ahead and trigger as well. So we've got these project cards, these project columns, whether we've gone ahead and, someone's made a repository public, a private repository public, we can get a notification there, the pull requests, etc. I think you're starting to get the idea there. So you can see just how many different types of events there are with GitHub Actions. There are so many different ones here. So that is what that on property is doing for us there. And again, we've got this example here. So if we jump past that on, then what we get is this env, and we can set some environment variables that are used for all the jobs. And we'll see how we've used those in our own GitHub Actions workflow a little bit later. And then we have jobs. So jobs are really the kind of building block inside of GitHub Actions. And jobs are the things where we can go ahead and run our actions. So a GitHub Action workflow is really made up of one or more jobs. By default, they run in parallel, but we can order them sequentially if we use a certain property. So you can see, for example, we've got jobs here, my first job, my second job. We've got these two jobs. This name is called my first job, this one's my second job, and these two would run in parallel because there's no needs property. Whereas a little bit lower, we've got jobs, job 1, job 2 needs job 1, and job 3 needs job 1 and job 2. So what that means is job 1 will start first, job 2 will go second because it needs job 1, and then job 3 will go last because it needs job 1 and job 2. You can then specify as well the runs on property, so what operating system it should go ahead and run on. And you can also specify any self-hosted runners as well. So I mentioned earlier that you can go ahead and push out all of these kind of tasks that are happening onto the GitHub Actions or GitHub agents, if you want to think about them that way, that are running elsewhere in GitHub somewhere in the cloud. Or you can run them in your own environment, in your own kind of cloud from an Azure perspective, maybe on Azure Stack, or maybe just on your virtual machine in your on-premises environment, or in your local machine on your laptop. I'm running mine on my gaming PC, and I actually have an Azure DevOps pipeline agent and a GitHub Actions task runner installed, and if I need to go and use them for anything. And then we have outputs as well, so we can go and take the outputs of a job there as well. So if we need to go ahead and kind of output something for it to be used as part of another step, we can go and do that. So you can see there's a number of really great and powerful things in here. We've got this if property under a specific job, and we can make it conditional if that job should even run based upon some kind of condition. We're not going to really focus on that today because that's getting quite advanced there. But again, if that's of interest, we can certainly do another session on that and another show on that one. But then here's where the real value comes in, the real power of GitHub Actions. And this is in these steps property here. So this job contains a sequence of tasks called steps, and they're just a series of commands. You could go and clone a repository, you could go and build a Docker file, you could go and publish something to Azure. Those are all different types of actions, and we saw those actions a little bit earlier. So now we're getting into some real depth about all of these actions and all of these tasks. There are other things in here as well, in terms of, timeout minutes, strategy, and kind of using a matrix and these kind of things, which we won't really get into today. But just be aware that they are there as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at my example. And remember, this is just an example. There are probably many ways that you can go and achieve something similar. This is just how I've done it. This is just for illustration purposes. So maybe I should go ahead and also show the website, just so you have a bit of a flavour of what this is. So this is the website that I've built. You can see it's still under development and still under work. And this is the home page. We have our navigation bar at the top and a login system here. And what I can do as a user is I can go ahead to the cards page and I can search for a particular card. So this card that I have here that I mentioned earlier is called the Winged Dragon of Ra. So let's go ahead and search for that. So if we scroll down, clearly I need to do a bit of tuning on my selection here. It doesn't look like it's in there. Maybe it's because I missed the out of the front. And there you go, there it is. So yes, definitely need to do a little bit of tuning on my search. I'll add that to the backlog. But you can see here this Winged Dragon of Ra. We click that. What's happening in the background? I still need to tweak the UI a little bit here because it's still loading. What it's doing is it's bringing from Azure Functions the information that I'm looking for. Azure Functions is my API. The call is going through API management in Azure. And the Azure Functions is reading from a Cosmos DB. So because I'm using the serverless here, that's why you saw a little bit of a delay there, because there's a cold start time where there are no instances spun up for me. So it just needs to go and warm up and then actually go and run. And you can see here now that I have my information. So this is a really cost-effective way for me to actually go ahead and run my service, because the Azure storage is actually what's hosting the website itself. I've got an Azure CDN in front of that, so the cost of that is very minimal because it's all static content. The actual backend APIs are hosted in Azure Functions in a serverless mode. API management is used in a serverless mode as well. And Cosmos DB, if you design it in a good way, can be very cost efficient as well for you. It works slightly differently to traditional kind of relational databases, so your modeling will be different. And again, that's a full session on its own. And if that piques your interest, let me know in the comments, because we can certainly schedule that in as another topic to talk about. But you get the idea, right? So I can go ahead and select kind of a set that this card was from. So maybe I'm interested in this particular set. So once again, there's a different microservice here in the background that's actually bringing all this data, hence a little bit of cold start. But you can see here all of the cards that then come from that particular set there. And I've got this nice, very quick navigation here going on. Very scalable as well, because it's using CDN, static content and serverless, so it will scale with those requests that I'm expecting to get in as well there. So a nice architectural design there. So let's think about that then. We've gone ahead, we've deployed the infrastructure. How do we go ahead and actually push out the application? Because we're talking not really about pushing to a server. We've got Azure Functions, we've got storage, we've got a CDN. What does that life cycle look like, and why, how would we translate that into our GitHub Actions? So as you remember, we have the .github folder under the root of our repository, and underneath that we have this workflows folder. And underneath these workflows, you can see that I've got a number of different YAML files. And these YAML files basically represent the different services that I'm deploying as part of my application. So as an example, we took a look at the card API because we searched for the cards. That was using Azure Search in the background. And once we had the search results, we clicked on the Winged Dragon of Ra. And that particular card, when we loaded up that page, called that card API. And that's where we got the data from. So let's just scroll in here and take a look at what's actually happening. So remember the kind of syntax that we used a bit earlier. So the name of this is Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards Card API Master. The reason I've called it Master is it's in my Master branch, and I still need to update my branches to be Main rather than Master. That's on my backlog to do. But underneath then you can see where we're triggering or what actually triggers this particular workflow. So we trigger on a push event when the paths are either the Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards Card API subfolder or any nested folders below that, or a change to this specific file itself. Basically, any files that change in the master branch then go ahead and cause this to actually trigger if they're in this repository path setup. So you're probably wondering, what on earth is this path stuff? Why is that in there? Well, there are different ways that you can structure your repositories. You can have multi-repositories, so many repositories, or mono-repositories, a single repository. And because it's just me working on the project, I've opted for a mono-repository because it's easier for me to go and manage just on my own. But in a large enterprise organization where there's different teams working on different repositories, maybe you don't want certain teams to have access to certain parts of the repository, you want to have a clean kind of code base and you want to have the history separated for each repository, then maybe that's where you would have these separate repositories. Again, another complete session on its own, so don't really read into that one. That's just how I've gone and done it for this particular setup. So then you can see I've got some environment variables, and these environment variables, I've got 3 of them. So the Azure Function App name, the Azure Function App package path, and the .NET version. So this relates to the information that is in my app service, effectively, my Azure function. It's not an app service, it's actually just an Azure function running in serverless mode for this particular example. And then we specify where the package is located and what .NET version we're using. And we use those environment variables a little bit later. Now what you can see is this is actually running on a Windows build because I'm using the Windows version of Azure Functions. And what we do is in our first step, because remember we're triggering on a push event, the first thing we need to do is actually get the code that we're talking about. So we have this kind of checkout GitHub action here. And remember, if we go to github.com/action/checkout, you will see that we have the GitHub action there, that repository backing that. So then next we have this setup.net environment, and just bear with me one moment. Okay. So this next step that we have, this next action that we have, is a setup.net environment. What this one does is, as you probably guessed, it sets up our .NET environment. And what it's doing is it's making sure we have the right version of the SDK that we've been building with locally, so 3.1.2, to go ahead and build on the agent for us, on the actual GitHub task runner. I'm also assigning a couple of extra properties there. So I'm specifying the .NET version that we assigned earlier on. And you can see we have this kind of special syntax here. This $2 curly brackets n of .NET version. And then we have a source URL as well. So that is the location of my package registry. And I'm hosting my packages in GitHub as well, in the GitHub package registry. And as you can see, we then also specify from the environment variable, or an environment variable, I should say, for this particular .NET task here that's running, this .NET action, we specify from our secrets the GitHub token that is being used. Now this is something that you can kind of inject and use dynamically, because if I jump up to my settings over here and we take a look at secrets, you will see that in here there's nothing about a GitHub token. So that's something that the task runner, the agent itself, just has access to as part of it being the GitHub task runner. So you can go ahead and reference that. Now the reason I'm using that GitHub token for this one is because I'm using the GitHub package registry. So to access the package registry, we need the token. So if you were using Azure Artifacts, for example, Artifactory or something else, then you would need to go and have the appropriate secret for that particular artifact store there. And then what we do is we have the resolve project dependencies. So what we do in this step is we just go down into that particular folder for that particular code. We do a build, and then we just go and build that in release mode. So what we're doing there really is just making sure that we have the appropriate binaries that we need, and then going ahead and doing the full release for ourselves there, and doing it as a clean kind of output ready for production. And then what we do is we have the final step of the task there that uses Azure Functions action with the ID FA. Of course, I could name it something different, and then some with, so some properties, some configuration for that action, and we give it the app name, we give it the package, and the publish profile there as well. And these again just all map to what we've set previously, apart from this one. Now you're probably thinking, hold on Chris, a little bit earlier you said that we can go ahead and use the Azure Login task before the majority of the Azure Actions. Why did you lie to us? I don't see that here. Yeah, I may have slightly twisted the truth a little bit. You use it in a lot of occasions, but for the Azure Functions example and app services as well, you use something called a publish profile. So if I go over to my Azure dashboard here and take a look at my card resource group and look at the function, we will see in here that we have at the top this get publish profile button. So we can go ahead and just download that. And if I clicked open on that, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to show that for the world. In there I get a string of information, and it's basically the connection string effectively for me to go ahead and push into my Azure function. So what I do is I go ahead, I come to the settings tab in my repository, I go to secrets, and what I do is I click new secret. And in there I would go ahead and put something like Azure_web app publish profile. I would copy and paste the information that goes in there. And there we go. We've gone ahead and pushed that one in there now. Awesome. But if I click update, I don't see the old information. So it's nice that from a user interface perspective, I can't go and see that once I've added that there. It's a secret. So at that point then, if we jump back to the action here, the workflow, we're now in a position where we can go ahead and trigger that. But let's just look at the other one a moment, because you saw that I had a card API master. I also have a card API PR. Now I could merge these into one file potentially, but I'm trying to keep them separate for now because they are two different workflows, and eventually they might do slightly different things the way I plan on designing my life cycle at least. Again, people will probably debate that, you know, what's a good way of doing that, but for this particular pet project, that's how I'm going to be doing it. Now the main difference here that you can see is the on property has changed. Instead we have the pull request event, this is all the same, but this time we trigger on both the master or the PR file being changed. So there's still the same paths generally being updated, but the difference being it has to be a pull request into master rather than a push or a commit into master. So let's go ahead and just create a quick new branch here. Or in fact, let's do something different. Let's go ahead and look at the pull request and see. There we go. Look at that. So I also have in my repository set up Dependabot. And what Dependabot is something from GitHub where it can go ahead and just evaluate what dependencies you're using in your repository and raise issues for you and intelligently understand, hey, you're actually using an outdated version of this particular package. You might want to go ahead and update that. So all of those tasks as a developer where you would just have to keep the lights on, this Dependabot, which is not related to GitHub Actions, but just something handy that I thought I'd throw in here, you can see it's helping me just keep on top of those things. So it's actually ran a check already. So if we take a look at that and look at the details, you can see, if I just zoom out a bit, that actually it has already gone ahead and ran that PR workflow that we talked about. So you can see it set up the job. We can see that it checked out the GitHub action that we need. It then, it checked out the code that we need there. Then it went ahead and set up the .NET environment, and look at all the rich information that we're getting in here as well. So I can see that it runs the Azure Functions action, and then it does the checkout GitHub action then as well. And obviously it all ran fine. It all ran as expected. Now, in reality, I shouldn't really be deploying into production for my, for my kind of pull request environment. That would be something that I would need to go ahead and switch that to like a dev environment or something similar, or just do a quick smoke test, check if it deploys or not. And again, mileage may vary depending upon how mature your DevOps setup is. Some people will go the whole hog and try to do smoke tests in the very beginning, whereas some might kind of iterate over that eventually. But you can see here that actually it built, it deployed, everything looks good. So for me, I'm happy. I'm going to go ahead and merge that. So that change has now been merged into master. And if I go ahead now and look at the code base, you can see that there was a merge 12 seconds ago, and there's this yellow icon that has now appeared. If I click on that, what we will see in real time is GitHub Actions and the tasks running on my GitHub Actions runner. And this is the GitHub Action task runner, which is hosted in GitHub. This is not the one which is running on my machine, because we specified the on to be the Windows version, and that's the kind of the public one there that we're running on. So what you can see what it's doing at this point is it's downloading the .NET SDK 3.1.2 for us, and it will go ahead and set up that environment appropriately. It'll go ahead and resolve the dependencies using .NET, and then it'll go and deploy the Azure function for us. So if we go ahead and just take a look at that URL and keep refreshing here, at some point in a moment we will see that there will be a slight blip where the Azure function has been deployed. So we can see that it's just doing that build step for us now. Might take a little bit longer, of course, than some of the other steps because it's got to do a little bit of compilation there for us. And while we're doing that, I will take the moment to go and have a quick drink. There we go. Okay, so it did the restore for us. It completed that step. All good. And now it's deployed, or rather deploying the function for us, I should say. There we go. It's initiating that deployment. You can see there. It's nice how it gives all of those output information. There we go. Now you can see it's taking a bit longer. That's where it's just done the restart for us. There we go. Services unavailable because it's had to do the kind of restart. And it's pushing the changes there for us. And lo and behold, it is back and working all good. And now if we jump up to the cards API, go and look for that winged dragon of Ra again. Click on that. And what we will see is, there we go, that API is working again as expected. All good. So we just made the change. We made the change to upgrade that dependency in that particular microservice. So it's quite nice because you can see that the GitHub action gave me the confidence that actually it's still built, it's still deployed, and there were no kind of issues with that deployment out. In reality, in a real world project, I would have a QA, a dev, a prod, etc. But because it's just myself working on a pet project right now, I haven't gone to that level of depth yet. As I start approaching maybe a more production kind of service, and if I decide to roll it out properly, then that is a step I would take. But for now, I'm keeping it very lightweight. So let's kind of recap so far. We've taken a look at, here we go, look at the right page here, the right tab. We've taken a look at a couple of the workflow files so far. But I mentioned that you can have multiple jobs. I've mentioned that there's this kind of login Azure CLI task as well. So where are they? Why haven't we seen them? Well, let's take a look at the front end. We'll only take a look at one of those front ends this time. We'll take a look at the master one rather than PR, just because they're both pretty much the same. So you'll get a feeling in terms of how similar they are. So what I do in here is I have the a good number of properties again. So we trigger on a push. It's for these particular subfolders and on a master change. And this time we're running on Ubuntu, so we're running on Linux. We check out, so we go ahead and use the kind of checkout to check out the code there. We then go ahead and set up Node this time because what we're building is a Vue app, so we need nodes to be able to go and do that. And what we do is we just go ahead and do an npm install to make sure we have all the right dependencies that we need. And this, all it's doing is just, this run step is just running the command line locally for us. That's what it's doing there. It's running a script. So that script then is just running like npm run build in our local command line. But it's setting the working directory as that one, and with these particular environment variables as the example. So what the base URI is for my API, what the kind of search endpoint is, what the search key is, and all these kind of configuration pieces. I could go ahead, of course, and use something like Azure App Config to go and do that. That's not something I have done yet, but there is a task that you can go and use to use that inside your workflow there as well, a GitHub action, I should say. And then what we do is we upload those artifacts, or kind of the build output, because we are pushing that output to a path called dist. So we're saying this, the binaries that are outputted from that build are now going to be an artifact called website that we're going to use. So we haven't pushed it to Azure yet. We haven't done anything with that yet, but that's where it will be for us. And then what I have is another job. So at this point in GitHub Actions, there is no there is no kind of complex CD functionality at the moment, but it's coming. So there, if you take a look at the GitHub roadmap here, you will see, if I filter down by actions, you will see that they have a number of great things that they're working on in here. So for example, for me in more of a release environment, I would care about having manual approvals. That's what I mean, that kind of way of determining whether a production release should go to production, and being able to have those checks. So if you are ever looking to understand what GitHub are working on and what's coming, you can just take a look in github.com/github/roadmap and take a look at these boards that they're using. And these are the same project boards that anyone else can go and use inside of GitHub as well. It's quite nice how they do this. So we can go and check on that particular issue and see what the latest is on that. And it looks like it's due to come in Q4 2020, so any time. So I might make some changes at a later point to my particular workflow here if I need to. So before deploying into production, personally I probably will want to have some kind of last minute final check. Do I approve for this manually? Yes, go ahead, click and go. But as you can see, so what we do for now, at least anyway, is this is a separate job that will run straight away after the other one because it needs the build. So we call that first job build. So it needs build to take place. And then these are the steps that will actually happen as a result of that. So we go and download the artifact. So you can see that we've got the upload artifact task and the download artifact task. So we got the kind of two tasks there. It's going to be called website, and we're going to put it in a kind of a subdirectory of website then. And here we have the Azure Login task. I did promise there was one, see, I didn't lie. And this Azure Login task is the same as me using the Azure CLI to log in. That's what we're doing here. And as you can see, we have this with property here, and that task particularly has a sub-property called creds. And what that's saying is, what is the kind of Azure CLI credential that we need to log in with? Well, as you saw a little bit earlier, we have in here the Azure Credentials Repository Secrets. So that actually contains a service principal CLI output that I've been able to put into that particular secret. So that's how I can go ahead and log in and perform some of these next tasks. It's not really me, it's a service principal doing it. So then what we do is we use the Azure CLI for the next few stages, or the next few tasks. We use Azure CLI v1, and that's the GitHub Action v1, not v1 of the Azure CLI. You can see a little bit lower which version of the Azure CLI we use. And you can see we just use an inline script, and all we do is have AZ storage blob, upload batch, account name. That is the name of the account we're uploading to, the storage account. This container, so the $web, if you've ever deployed a static website using Azure Storage, you know there's a $web special folder you can deploy to for that. And we're taking the contents of the path that we have on our agent, where our binaries are ready for production use, binaries are held. And what we're saying is just take all those files and upload them up to the storage account. That's what that command line is doing for us. And then we have another step here, and what that is doing is, all very much the same up until the actual command line script. And what we're seeing is with Azure CDN, we're going to purge the endpoint that we're using. So we're going to take anything under the CDN endpoint. We're going to go for that profile, and yes, I know there's a typo in my CDN, in my profile. I just need to go ahead and automate some of the changes for my deployment. But there we've got Yu-Gi-Oh cards and then the resource group that it's in. So again, I did spot a pull request here where we can go ahead and try that, I think. So if we go ahead and use the upload artifact here, if I take a look, I suspect we will see that there was a front-end PR. Excellent. So we'll go ahead and merge that. And that's gone and merged. And what we will now see, once again, when we look at our repo and look at the details, is we can see that this Yu-Gi-Oh Cards front-end master workflow has been triggered. So notice so far that we only see the build step at the moment. And look how quickly it's getting through that. It's only taken, what, about 10 seconds maybe, just over that. It's set up the job, it's checked out, it's set up the node environment for us, and it's just installing the dependencies now. That's way quicker than anything that I could have done on my machine if I was doing that manually. So this is where you also get some of that agility through automating some of these build and release processes. Now, what we'll see here if we jump in is, of course, all of the kind of binaries and dependencies that it needs from a node perspective, so my actual front-end application and what that needs. So there we go, we can see that it's building for production, and eventually then what we'll get to is to upload the website as an artifact, and then it will start working on that second job for us. So eventually when the approvals and kind of some of those CD type features come in, I'll then potentially slightly change how this is set up to be in line with whatever that model works with there. But we can see all of the warnings there. Quite nice that we get that outputted there. Makes it nice and easy for us to check if there's anything we need to follow up on later. And you can see that it's nice and easy to look at those right from within GitHub Actions UI here as well. But I can then go ahead and look at publish. Now, of course, you're probably thinking, hold on now, you haven't ran any tests or anything yet either. Where are they? Well, I haven't written any. Again, it's just me on this project, so I'm kind of just trying to prioritize the minimum viable product at least, and then I'll go ahead and bake more of the quality pieces in. I know that's not strictly, test-driven development, but this is a pet project. This is just for fun, so that's why I've written things that way around. If it was something where I really needed quality baked in, then yes, I would start with those tests for sure. So what you can see this task is doing now is this is the Azure CLI task, which is uploading those files to my storage account. So remember that to go to www.yugiOhcards.co.uk, what's happening is I've got an Azure DNS record pointing to my CDN. The CDN's origin is the storage account. So we first need the files uploaded in the storage account, so we've got the latest and greatest there. And then what we need to do is go ahead and purge the CDN endpoint so that our users get the latest and greatest cached content then. And that is kind of how it works in a nutshell. There are some more advanced and deeper functionalities there, but overall that is GitHub Actions in a nutshell. So a couple of things just in terms of the editing experience and how you kind of author these before we start looking at wrapping up here. If I go ahead and edit this particular file, you'll see that I get a slightly different UI to what I get editing some of my other files in GitHub. So if I go ahead and just edit, I don't know, this, let's go into a function, let's go look at that. So you can see in here I've got some code going on. If I click edit on that, it's just a normal kind of editor that you would go and expect. Whereas for this .github/workflows folder, I have this nice kind of user interface. I can go ahead inline, go ahead and do my dash, and generally I get the autocomplete. So if I go ahead, and it doesn't look to be working on my browser for some reason at the minute, but that's okay. You do normally get a nice kind of pop-up experience there, but for whatever reason my browser isn't playing ball at the moment, but that's okay. So what we can then do right in line is search and go, okay, I'm looking for the Azure Actions. I want to go ahead and I want to use the Azure Login action. So I can just go ahead, click that, I can go and copy that, paste that over, and you can see that it's complaining there actually in line about just something. Why is that complaining? Well, I mentioned about how YAML deals with kind of spaces and white space there, and you can see that that has now resolved that one. But now because it realizes that's a valid action, it's evaluating that and going, hold on, this value can't be null. So that's where I would go ahead and put in my secrets.azure credential, for example, to reference the secret that we have stored in our repo secrets. And then I'll just turn that one off for now to not enable PowerShell login. And you can see, there we go, that's the action added. So that's quite a nice editing experience there. I'm not going to add that one to that one for now because we don't need that. But just so you're aware as well, if you use VS Code, I haven't personally actually used this extension. I was just doing a bit of searching before we went live. And there is a VS Code community extension. This is not an official extension, important to note. This is made by Christopher Schleiden in the community. And you can go and see and take a look again at the GitHub repository there and what's kind of going on in there, and take a look at the code like you would expect from a GitHub repository. But you can see the editing experience that you get there, and that's a similar kind of experience that you get in the GitHub UI, but for whatever reason mine wasn't showing it at that point. So you've got that one there. What you also have, which might be useful, is maybe I closed it down. No, there it is. So if you go to github.com/azure/action-workflow-samples, you can see in here that the Microsoft Azure team are actually pulling together a load of these different examples and these different samples. So I could go ahead in here and say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and build my Azure function. And it's going to be a Windows.NET function. And actually, this is using the older approach. Let's go ahead and use the publish profile approach. What you can see is actually this is very similar to the action and the workflow that we used a little bit earlier. Because this is kind of based, this is based off, or rather, my function is based off this, I should say. So you can see these are some great samples that if you're looking to get going and trying to put those building blocks together of how to trigger some of these things in Azure, then you could go ahead and use some of these samples here. So definitely worth being aware of that particular GitHub page as well. And what it will also do is it will go ahead and it will link out to some of these other GitHub Actions as well that you can go and use. So if you click on this particular link, you can go and see all of the various GitHub Actions that have been kind of officially published by the Azure team. And remember, they're the ones that have the kind of blue tick next to them in that marketplace view and have the Azure logo next to them as well. Cool. So with that, I think we're probably heading on about an hour for this live stream now. So I think that's enough information. I think that's enough kind of coverage so far in terms of GitHub Actions and what they are. So I hope that's been useful. Feedback is always welcome. I know there's a lot of topics that we've kind of skirted around and maybe would have been interesting to go into a little more depth as well. Let me know. Let me know if you want to go ahead and dive into any of those as well, because the content, I really want it to be relevant for you. I want it to be relevant for the community. This is why I'm doing this. I really want to make sure that I'm pushing stuff out there that is useful for people. I don't want to put content out there for the sake of it. So do let me know if there's certain questions that you have. Maybe you've started playing with GitHub Actions yourself, and let me know about your experience. Let me know in the comments below. How has that been going? Have you been having any challenges? Is it going really well? What is that looking like? Because I'd love to find out and I'd love to hear more about that. So, you know the deal. I'd love for you, please, to go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Please like on Twitter and follow on Twitter. Please go ahead, follow my various profiles. I am available also on Spotify. I'm available on iTunes and Google Play Music as well. But the format moving forward is really going to be a lot more oriented towards something like Twitch, something like YouTube, because it's going to be very interactive. So we've had a whistle-stop tour and an introduction into GitHub Actions and some of the Azure Actions that are available, and how I've used GitHub Actions on one of my own pet projects. We looked at secrets, we looked at how we would use secrets for the publish profile for the Azure function or an Azure app service, and we also looked at how we would use the secrets for the Azure CLI and logging in with a service principal. We then looked at how we'd use the different jobs, and then how we use those kind of dependencies and those actions in our workflow. We saw there are different triggers, push, pull, and all of these other ones that don't need to be used for CI/CD as well. So we've covered quite a lot of ground there. All that there is left to say is I'm going to be trying to do a regular cadence of these kinds of videos, so keep an eye out. You will see already that actually we have one scheduled for next Friday once again. That is going to be with myself and my colleague and good friend Willie Spree, and we're going to be covering this architectural pattern called the geode pattern. So it's going to be a very interesting one if you are interested in building high-scale global kind of applications and you care about low latency and making sure that those applications are resilient. Let me know again if you've got content that you'd love to find out more about, any topics, or you'd even love to be on the show and talk to me about something. Get onto the website, www.cloudwithchris.com. There's a couple of links. Go and submit those forms, and then I will be in touch with you very, very soon. So until the next time, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for the support, and I'm really happy to have kicked off this journey with you. So with that, I'll see you next week, and thank you so much again for tuning in. Bye for now.